This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Only a few minutes for questions for any of us.
I guess I should qualify this question by acknowledging that I think all of you are doing really great work. But then to kind of turn it down to a sort of more critical point, I mean, my question is, to what extent do you think about how Emory employs your various offices in the promotion of its image, to market its status as a place that's diverse, tolerant, and, I'm thinking about the way in which a lot of universities have adopted a corporate model where, to some extent, they've acknowledged that, bigotry, sexism, intolerance are not good for quote-unquote business. And, I'm curious, because this is something I think about often, how in your various positions you kind of think through this issue as well.
Well, I think it's a great question. That's what I'll say just quick. Emory is an institution. I'm not talking about our individuals because I don't know everybody. It's a racist institution. It's a sexist institution. It's a homophobic institution. And I think we all struggle with, all of us, with our employer. Because we make up the society, we create this community for good or for ill. And so I think most institutions, and at least, I'm most familiar with the United States, some places in Europe, most institutions in the United States are racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic. So I don't know how we get past the question of are we going to only focus on image or are we going to focus on substance. I think the way we get there is by people asking critical questions about what's the purpose here. And I think this goes to my support of Leslie early on and really asking her, so if TCP is inspired and funded at a moment of crisis, 5 years later, will it continue to be funded in some fashion? This is a tough economic period, given that we know that the conditions that produced the events that occurred in 2003 and 4 probably aren't that much different from today. There may be a smaller group of people that are much more invested, but there's still a lot of people who have not participated fully. So I think you can expand that to any of the things that we're focused on. The provost, when I came on board, was very interested in trying to really infuse energy in the Office of Disability Services. We were able to hire one more person at this particular moment. The hire happened, in the summer. It was a difficult thing to do, given our economic needs. But I think the provost and the president showed a great deal of interest in making certain that office was much more functional and had a greater capacity to be of assistance, offer expertise to the campus. But these are difficult times. So I think it's a really good question, but we're doing the best we can given the histories that we exist with, and also given our kind of political and economic realities. And hopefully, if we descend too much into fluff and image, someone will kick us.
The only other thing I would add is that my check-in is with the people who participate in community dialogues, and when they see it as something that's not addressing what they need, the skills that they need to build around these issues, then we'll know we're done. But so far, we haven't gotten that message. So it's about having a feedback loop with the community. Michael, and then we'll have to end.
Yeah, just kind of a quick observation, maybe you could respond to it. So one of my observations with the number of programs and institutes represented here is that when events are held, there is, of course, diversity in a number of ways, but one way in which you see very limited forms of diversity has to do with gender, that for the most part, gender and race. By that I mean, for the most part, white males here at Emory University tend to not participate in almost any of these things that we're talking about. Either I think they deem it as nothing to do with them, or they lack courage and therefore are cowards. So you can decide which category you want to put them in. And so I'm just kind of wondering, how are you thinking about, if at all, ways of trying to ensure that there are more men participating in a number of these initiatives, and in particular, white men?
I think you're exactly right. The Men Stopping Violence program is one avenue that we hope to, kind of change that. But I think you're right. And the reason that might work is that it is men talking about being men, right? So you have to really, I think, engage men and white men in their own. So in other words, I think because things are about women, often men don't come. You know, and there, you have to do particular things, I think, to kind of break that up and to get people to see that even though I'm not the race or gender of the topic, perhaps it might be relevant to me, you know, anyway. But
I'll say one thing: the TCP has been heavily female, and although even in terms of Black white participation and other groups clustered around it, one thing that having a long trajectory, 5 years plus, helps you think through some of these issues. And one of the things that's happened as we've gotten the willing to then go out and do some work among their own communities. So we have some white men within the organization who are doing that work. And then we have people who hear about it finally turn away from what they're doing and decide to give us some time and energy. So we're starting to see a bump in the numbers of white men. And then at the top, at the administrative top, which is heavily white and male, they're also very much now engaged in having their own dialogue. So leadership is one of the answers to that question.
I would just also add that it's not only that in many cases white men, or I should say particularly heterosexual white men, don't perceive that that these issues are relevant to them, but that in many cases, particularly in this time of scarcity, I'm seeing increasing evidence on campus that people perceive that it is disadvantageous for them to renounce in certain ways their privilege in order to participate in support of these projects. And I think that realistically, one of the ways in which we struggle against that is by continuing to kind of force the issue and create avenues for the sharing of scholarship and public programming that is clearly advantageous for the entire community, and really pushing dialogue about why it's advantageous for the entire community. And I think that one of the ways that we do that is by really addressing, again, this issue of intersectionality and making it really clear that there is no kind of mythical norm, to borrow from Audre Lorde, of this kind of uniquely privileged white male who doesn't face or have some of these issues or need to be engaged in some of these questions in order kind of to better their own plight, as well as to kind of do the work that they claim to do.
The other thing I would maybe add, and this maybe doesn't go with this kind of event where it's people gathering to talk about ideas and listen to papers and consider things. So I think my response is more on the how do we engage white men, straight white men, a white institution in thinking about the place of others in it. And I think it has to do with holding each other, including white men, accountable. And so I don't know how we do that effectively. Certainly I've spoken with provosts about it, who we hire as deans, who we hire, who we select and choose to keep in as chairs of departments. I think there's how we recognize people for the service and the scholarship that they have engaged in, institutional. This goes to whether it's actually symbolic or whether it's meaningful. But I think there are ways in which that we haven't yet fully explored how we engage with each other about this is in fact serious business. And so I think some white men, I think rightfully so, have decided that even if they are interested, it's just not that serious. That it doesn't affect their needs in the workplace or their needs in their scholarship. But I think we may have to figure out ways to address that structurally.
On that note, thank you very much.
We'll take about a 10-minute break, and there's some more snacks in the back. There's some get some cookies and nuts to get a little energy. Finish.
Down. And I'm used to this. I teach tax. Nobody listens to me. Why should this be different? My name is Dorothy Brown. I'm a law professor at Emory University. I am the moderator for this panel, and I'm going to let you know what it is we're going to do. We're going to speak in the order that we are in on the program. We are each going to introduce ourselves, and our introductions will count against our 15-minute time. Okay? Give me a hand, okay? And Amanda is going to be a strict timekeeper. Okay, so I'm going to talk with you about the work that I do, which lies at the intersection of critical race theory and federal tax policy. Huh? Yeah, you're not hearing it wrong. I have, since 1996, been studying the racial implications of federal tax policy. And when I started doing the work, I kind of fell into it. I read an article that said, how do you know there isn't a race and tax problem if you don't look? And I thought, oh, what a good idea. I'll make this my research agenda. Well, there's a problem. And you could figure this out if you think back to your tax form, your 1040, and the box you checked for your race. Wait, no box. Hello? There's no race data kept by the IRS. So it could have been one of the shortest scholarly agendas known to man, but born and raised in the South Bronx, you don't tell me no and have me listen to it. Undaunted, I said, okay, I'll get proxy data sets, which is what I've done. So I've looked at any number of different data sets to come up with analysis of different federal tax provisions. So I'm just going to talk with you about 3 of them. This year I'm on sabbatical. Woohoo! I'll say that. And I'm writing a book on tax reform from a race and class perspective. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm writing a book for a commercial publication, not an academic press, because I want to transform the world. Okay. So the 3 parts of the Internal Revenue Code I'm going to talk about is going to be the joint return, the tax subsidies for housing, and the lower tax rate on capital gains. So they're going to be a part of 3 chapters in my book. So the first chapter on the joint return I'm calling the Huxtables versus the Romanos. Okay, the Huxtables, you may recall, African-American couple, husband's doctor, wife is a partner at a law firm, both very successful. Stick a pin in that. Deborah and Ray Romano, you may recall, Ray works outside in the paid labor market. Deborah works inside the home, contributing her services, I might add, tax-free. Okay, the joint return says but I digress, right? But it really isn't a digression. When you get married, your taxes can go up from what they would be if you stayed single. We call that a marriage penalty. Or it could go down from where it would be if you stayed single. We call that a marriage bonus. Well, lo and behold, under the stuff happens category, what we find is the marriage penalty kicks in the greatest when the husband and the wife make roughly equal amounts. And the marriage bonus kicks in the greatest when the husband works in the paid labor market and the wife is a stay-at-home spouse. So I don't even have to give you the punchline, right? African-American couples are more likely to be equal wage earners, and married white couples are more likely to be single wage earner households. So African-American couples more likely to pay a marriage penalty, white couples more likely to get a bonus. Okay. So one could say, oh, that's a fluke, Dorothy. What are you talking about? You just found the one provision in the Internal Revenue Code that, has an impact by race. Okay, Mr. Robinson's neighborhood. You may think, is she talking about Mr. Rogers' neighborhood? Well, I'm talking about Eddie Murphy's version of it. Remember Saturday Night Live? Mr. Robinson's neighborhood. Well, would you be mine? Could you be my neighbor? Here's what we find, and Tyrone talked about this earlier. Depending on who your neighbors are, will determine how much gain you're going to get from the sale of your home. And actually, if you live in a neighborhood with more than 10% African Americans, the value of your property declines. Okay, and the more African Americans you have in your neighborhood, the lower the value. Okay, tax subsidies for housing. One of the big tax subsidies for housing is the exclusion from income for gain on the sale of your principal residence, up to $500,000 if you're married. And anything over that, you get taxed at the flat capital gains rate. Okay, well, if black homeowners, and most black homeowners live in majority minority neighborhoods, and white homeowners live in homogenous, more than 90% white neighborhoods, have homes and they sell them, we could see how this is going to play out. White homeowners are going to have more gain to exclude than black homeowners because of the cap based on, would you be my neighbor? Now, the third provision I'm looking at is capital gains, and I've entitled this chapter, The Buffett Effect. Not buffet, Buffett, as in Warren Buffett, okay? He is my poster child for the book as well as this particular chapter. Okay, so Warren Buffett outed himself in 2006 and said, in 2006, I made $47 million. I want to pause for a moment of silence right there. Okay, Warren Buffett made $47 million, and his tax rate was 17.7%. His secretary, on the other hand, he didn't out her salary, but we know it's nowhere near $47 million. Her tax rate, 30%. Warren says something's wrong with this picture. Now, you got to give him points, right? Because this is an admission against interest. He's saying, I need to pay more taxes because, you know, $47 million, I guess I can afford it, okay? Now, he also said he could pay more in taxes because he saw some inequity in his secretary's tax rate being higher than his own. So why is his secretary's tax rate higher than his own? Because she, like we, get wages. And he, unlike most of we, get gains in the form of sales of stock, okay? Capital gains that's taxed at a 15% rate, corporate dividends that are received on that stock that's now taxed at a 15% rate. So while conventional wisdom says the progressive tax rate structure is good for poor people because they don't pay a lot of taxes, ha ha, ha ha, ha ha. No, the progressive tax rate structure is good for Warren Buffett because he has lots of money and doesn't pay a lot in taxes. It's really not a benefit to be poor and not pay a lot in taxes. That's kind of like fair play. Okay? What's a benefit is to be rich and not pay a lot in taxes. So what my book is going to do is basically walk you through the Internal Revenue Code and a number of provisions showing how the race and class dynamic of these various tax provisions have a certain group of people consistently winning, and they're like the Warren Buffetts of the world. Now, when I started doing this work, I focused on race in and of itself. And the first question in the audience was always, but Dorothy, isn't it class and not race? No, it's not class and not race. But in order to intellectually respond to that question, I actually broadened my analysis. So I do race and class. So for example, one of the arguments that I'm making in the Buffett Effect chapter is whites at every income level pay a lower or more likely to pay less in taxes than blacks because they're more likely to own stocks than blacks are. Dorothy, isn't that a class problem? Well, not so much, because what you actually see when you look at the data is lower income whites are more likely to own stock than higher income blacks. Ariel Schwab, Ariel Capital Management Company out of Chicago, and Schwab, you've heard them, the big investment firm, has done surveys of whites and African Americans over 10 years. Each year they ask people who earn over $50,000, where do you want to invest your money in? Whites answer stock. Blacks answer real estate, okay? And based on my Mr. Robinson's neighborhood, it's like, no, no, no. You know, buy a house because you want better schools, less crime, but don't buy a house because you think this is going to be a good financial investment. Because for the typical African American, it isn't. For the African American like Chris Rock, it is. Why are you picking on Chris Rock? Well, because Chris Rock, again, outs himself. So this is my tax is everywhere. So I'm at home, I'm watching, Kill the Messenger, HBO special from Chris Rock, and he's talking about where he lives. He lives in Alpine, New Jersey. He goes, I live in $1 million house. Boos in the audience. He goes, don't hate the player, hate the game, okay? I live in $1 million house, and there's only 4 black people in my neighborhood. Hundreds of houses, 4 black people. They're me, Eddie Murphy, Mary J. Blige, and Jay-Z. So I thought, this is like the best intro to this homeownership article I just finished. Because if Chris is right, and there's only 4 or 5 blacks in his neighborhood, he's made a really good financial investment, okay? Most blacks, however, don't obviously live in Alpine, New Jersey, and they don't live in communities like Alpine, New Jersey. So what I found as I uncovered this, and as I mentioned before, I started this project in 1996, I looked at the joint return and I said, oh, there's a problem here, but I don't know what the solution is, because I don't know if it's just aberrational, if there are other provisions of the code. Well, I've looked at employer-provided pensions, I've looked at the earned income tax credit, I've looked at the tax treatment for children, and you find out low-income kids are treated worse than middle-income kids. So everywhere I look, I see this race and class dynamic, and I've come to a conclusion that the problem is the progressive tax rate. The problem is we say we have a progressive tax rate, which means higher income, higher rate, ability to pay. But we have a system that's being gamed by people with higher income that don't pay at the progressive tax rate structure. So I'm going to end with something that's going to make your hair stand on end because of the proposal I'm about to suggest, which is one that my book is going to suggest, which is we need to repeal the progressive tax rate structure and have a flat tax. A flat tax. Unlike the flat tax proposals that are out there now, which say wages should be taxed, but not capital gains. No, 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 no. The Brown flat tax proposal says everything should be taxed at the flat rate. So it doesn't matter whether you get married or you stay single, the rate is going to be the same. I'm going to end it there.
I'm Martha Feynman, and I'm a Robert W. Woodruff professor in the law school, and that's going to be my short introduction. My focus in my research has really been on the law and the state as institutions, and on political theory and political culture as the milieu in which our expectations and aspirations for law and the state are formed. So that's what I want to talk about today. And the organizing concept for my approach to this question of state, political, and collective responsibility is that of vulnerability, the concept of vulnerability. So I'm really not going to talk about race and difference, and I really want to talk about sameness and the way in which we can think about ourselves as the same. I assert up front that vulnerability is a universal and ever-present aspect of the human condition. Human beings as embodied creatures are all and always vulnerable. And this is due to the ever-constant possibility of dependency. We might become physically or otherwise dependent on our care for others, by others, including society and its institutions. And of course, the most likely societal institutions to do this care work are the state or the family. I've moved to this concept of vulnerability in response to what I see as the failures of law, a failure that's really the result of law's paradigm of formal equality and its limited ability to respond to the gross and growing economic and material injustice that continues to mar the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. So the problem, to me at least, is that our current constitutional and statutory equality regime analyzes equality through the lens of discrimination. It's independent of and seemingly oblivious to existing inequalities of distribution. Unless there's some distortion introduced by impermissible bias, the feeling is that the state should not interfere. And we all know the list of identity categories found in equal protection doctrine: race, gender, not class, that's not in the law, religion, and national origin. But these classifications not only define individual identity, they also form the basis for formation of interest groups, and ultimately they direct the concern and content of the law itself. These categories organize equal protection doctrine, which is framed in terms of disallowing discrimination against someone who occupies one of these categories. The problem, in my opinion, however, is that these categories have become the way we understand and explain material, social, and political inequalities. And in law, elimination of discrimination against certain identities becomes the quest, not the elimination of the inequalities for which they serve as proxies. This would be poverty, denial of dignity, and the absence of basic social goods. The problem with the categories is that they are both over and under inclusive. Not all women are paid 75 cents on the male dollar, and not all men are paid 100 cents on the male dollar. Some men are unemployed, and some women make 150 cents on the male dollar. Now, this is not to say that discrimination does not exist, and so I want to put that up front. I know it exists, and it's a problem, and laws that address discrimination should be strengthened. But what I want to point out is that our sense of equality is weak, that its promise is largely illusory because it fails to take into account existing inequalities of circumstance. The second point that's related to this is that our equality allows responsibility for this inequality of circumstance to be placed on the individual. The state and society's institutions are not implicated unless there's discrimination. Equality equals formal access, no discrimination, an absence of discrimination. Note how the individual and the state are positioned in this particular discourse. The individual must rise to the occasion, the equal opportunity occasion presented by the state. They must show that they have individual merit that warrants their acceptance. They must be self-sufficient, they must exercise individual responsibility, and they must be independent in doing so. Which brings me to the concept of dependency, which is where I really started initially with this particular project. And I had developed earlier a theory of dependency that was really an argument for societal responsibility, at least in some contexts. And of course, dependency is viewed in contemporary discourse as a very negative condition or status, and there are attempts to eradicate dependency by removing incentives such as welfare payments to poor single mothers. The political rhetoric that surrounds us treats dependency as something that can be eliminated and as something that is within individual control. Those who have been deemed dependent are thereby deservingly punished and stigmatized in our society. Now, by contrast, my theory of dependency begins with the argument about dependency's universality. Dependency is inevitable. It is universal. Dependency in this context, the way that I'm thinking about it here, is a biological and developmental category. It's something that is inherent in the human condition. All of us, everyone in this room, was dependent as an infant and as a child, and many of us, most of us perhaps, will also be dependent as we age, become ill, or are disabled. Other types of dependency we know are in existence and may actually even accompany this biological and developmental form of dependency. So we can talk about economic dependency, psychological, emotional dependency. But these have not been the focus of my concern, so I kind of put those to the side, except to demonstrate how complex and varied the relationships are that may be crammed into this concept of dependency. This one simple word does not capture the range of complex relationships to which we apply it. But there is another form of dependency that's been central to my work, and I call this derivative dependency. This is the social or institutional concept or component of dependency. It's a very simple concept. Those who care for others, those who care for the inevitable dependents, for the children, for the elderly, for the ill, they are themselves in need of resources and social support in order to undertake that care and succeed. They are derivatively dependent because of the societal tasks they perform. Important in regard to derivative dependency is the fact that unlike inevitable dependency, unlike the biological dependency, derivative dependency is not a universal experience, quite the contrary. Care work is structured through law and social institutions, channeled so as to be the responsibility and obligation of only some members of our society. This is a gendered argument. In the US today, the ideology of family responsibility does this channel channeling works. So we know that families are supposed to be responsible for dependency. The family is the way we privatize dependency, and the family, like the individual, is supposed to be independent and self-sufficient in performing its task of caring for the child, the elderly, the ill. Families that have to resort to the state for support are deemed failures, and casting the family as separate, private subjects only to non-intervention principles in this way justifies, I think, politicians, philosophers, policy analysis in ignoring dependency and its relationship to poverty and inequality, so that our policymakers, politicians, intellectuals, academics can put dependency to the side and not think about what its implications are. So we feel free to assume a competent, functioning private family as we spin out our theories of justice, equality, efficiency, and autonomy. This is highly unjust. For one thing, privatizing dependency in the way we do furthers inequality within the family. With family dependency work, it might be delegated to the family initially, but within that family, it typically devolves to one member. In most instances, the care work continues to be borne by women who are socialized in the roles as mothers, wives, daughters, and so on. Now, I came to the realization that this set of social arrangements, with this set of social arrangements, gender equality would be next to impossible for women to achieve, at least as if they became mothers. And this is so because caretakers are actually punished or disadvantaged by the ways in which the free market is structured in our free market institutions, and also disadvantaged by the lack of regulatory supervision by the state or response by the state. So the point is, this kind of analysis pointed me to the further realization of injustice, and this is turning the gaze to the larger society. Privatizing dependency also fosters and encourages freeloading by the rest of the society on the family. Care work is an unrecognized subsidy built on the back of the family. And you look at the benefits that are conferred by this care work. It is that work that produces, the care labor that produces the whole society and its institutions. It produces the worker, the taxpayer, the soldier, the consumer, the teacher, the students. All of this work that's put in gives us, the members of our society. Society should share the burdens associated with this vital and indispensable labor, but it does not. So, in fact, far from sharing the burdens, what society and the market do is to go on, as though they're entitled to appropriate this labor that's done in the family. So this was the basis for my claim against the state, my claim on the state, actually, for resources, for more structuring, more sharing of responsibility for this care work, a claim I made on behalf of caretakers and those who are dependent on those people for their care. Now, this claim was met with a very dismissive response. The response was, oh, dependency. Well, that's only episodic and sporadic. True, we're all dependent when we're children, but we outgrow it, and certainly I'll never be dependent when I'm old, old or ill. And there's some truth to this. I mean, you can think about dependency in this way as episodic. And further, of course, as I already mentioned, many of us escape or effectively manage our derivative dependency. So our inevitable dependency might be episodic, that's the way we experience it, and many of us can escape or effectively manage the derivative dependency. And what this did then was to lead me to this concept of vulnerability. Like dependency, vulnerability is universal. All human beings are vulnerable, but vulnerability is not episodic, sporadic, or largely developmental in nature. Vulnerability is constant throughout life, representing not only the dependency we experienced in the past, in our childhood, for example, but also the threat that we might become dependent in the future. Vulnerability is the present potential for all of us to become dependent, and it comes in the wake of our susceptibility to bodily injury or failure. Now, that injury or failure might be produced by natural disasters. You think about floods, this would be the Katrina system. It could come as the result of human activities or human actions, such as crime or the terrorist attacks. It could also come when the institutions in our society fail us because they're biased, because they're corrupt, because they're captured, or just because they're incompetent or inadequate to the task. And this would be the situation, I think, with the recent economic and banking crisis, where so many of our societal institutions failed, exposing our vulnerability. Like dependency, vulnerability has both an individual and an institutional component. Both our personal and our social lives are marred or marked by vulnerability. On the individual level, vulnerability encapsulates, again, this universal and constant fragility inherent in the human condition. And of course, from an individual perspective, vulnerability may be experienced differently. So there are differences in our experience of vulnerability. And this is influenced by the quality and quantity of the resources that we possess as individuals. But two things: vulnerability cannot be avoided, cannot be eliminated. And two, what defines this experiential differentiation that we can see is society and its institutions. In fact, I argue that society and its institutions are structured into systems that can be understood to provide assets to individuals that give individuals resilience in the face of our vulnerability. The assets may be physical or material. This would be generated through systems of compensation, wealth, or property. Assets may be in the form of human capital, generated through systems of education and employment, for example, giving us capabilities in sense terms. Assets are also social, provided by systems of family and other cultural groups or associations, so that we get assets that way. And I'm thinking also of assets provided by systems of ideology, systems that organize things like race and ethnicity and gender. A vulnerability analysis looks at the obligation of the state to support an implementation and maintenance of vital equality regime. And I have to stop there. In any case, I was going to look at privilege, and in this I look at how the state privileges and how that really has to be what we encounter, existing systems and organization of privilege in order to really have a meaningful equality. Thanks.
F5. Huh? Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. This is really a great opportunity for us to come together and have some important conversations. I'd like to particularly thank the organizers and the leaders of RDI for giving us this chance and bringing us together this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I do and the kind of work that is being done in a relatively recent field in the academic world, and that is disability studies. I'm fortunate enough to be along with other colleagues in a cluster of faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students here at Emory who are working in disability studies. And I wanted to, I should introduce myself, I guess. My name is Rosemary Garland Thompson. I am in the Department of Women's Studies here at Emory University. And it's probably important to mention as well that my original field of study is literary studies, so I bring my analysis to disability and to identity in general from the perspective of humanist, which is an important way to inflect what it is that I do. So I thought I would, because it's almost 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, bring to you pictures and stories. However, As we do, I'm going to begin with words and ideas that will lead to pictures and stories. So if you will bear with me for just a very short period of time, I wanted to offer up to you a definition, and there are, of course, many ways of defining any particular field of analysis, but this is just my definition of disability studies, the area of study in which I and many of our colleagues participate. So, words first, pictures next. Disability studies, I want to offer, is an interdisciplinary academic field of inquiry that expands health science perspectives by examining understandings of disability from cultural perspectives, such as, so these are the various ways that we can think about disability, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about and show you some pictures in regard to. So first and perhaps most important is that we look at disability as a category of critical analysis. And what that means is that disability is a term, and I'll talk more fully about this, a concept that circulates in the world, that gives meaning to things, to the social order, to us as human beings, and to our interactions with one another, and the political and social structures that we build. As such, it's important to look at this concept, this idea of disability, and see how it affects all of these aspects of human life. So, more on that later. Another way of thinking about disability is that it's a civil and human rights issue. That has to do, as much as anything, with an historical look at the concept of disability. While there have always been, of course, and always will be, aspects of human variation that we now think of as disability, the very term disability has a history, and a more recent history, because disability emerged as the term used to describe this kind of human variation as a result of the civil rights movement and the human rights movement of the last 30 or 40 or 50 years in the world, in the egalitarian world, let's say. So that the term itself, disability, gets brought forward through a set of civil rights legislations in the United States starting in the 1970s and elsewhere as well. I'm just going to talk primarily about the United States. A series of legislative policies and codes came forward to integrate people with disabilities into the public sphere and to protect people with disabilities against discrimination. And those sets of laws have become more capacious and have developed, culminating more or less in the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and its amendments in 2009, which have defined a set of the population who we think of as disabled. In other words, the word disability and the term disabled has been put together historically by legal mandates and codes. So that's why the term disability is of important political and social use at this particular moment in this particular place. Okay, for our purposes here, disability defines or can be understood as constituting a minority identity group. So in this sense, disability is an identity category along with other identity categories, or what we might call forms of difference, or what Paula was calling biological variations, biological differences. I like to use the term human variations. So an identity category is a way of constituting, as Paula explained in eloquent and complete detail, groups of people by endowing biological differences with cultural and social meaning. And disability then is one of those systems that produces a population. Okay? So, a legally constituted group. I mentioned very briefly this system of laws that has given us, at this particular moment in history and at this particular moment in the U.S., a group constituted as disabled, literally constituted. And that entry into that group is defined not so much by people's variant embodiments, but by people's social positions in relation to the environment and the institutions in a political order. Also, disability, of course, is a sociological formation in the sense that as an identity group, it's a way that we understand ourselves. As an identity group, it is what sometimes people call a narrative of self. It's a narrative that one can claim. It's a narrative that one can ascribe to others. And in that sense, disability becomes a sociological interaction between people and among people in a social order. I mentioned briefly that disability and people with disabilities are an historical community. In other words, we have a long way of being as people with disabilities. There are many different terms, there are many different groups, and much work is being done in disability history. I've done a lot of work around sideshows and freak shows in the 19th century and before, which I consider part of the labor history of people with disabilities because, of course, people with disabilities made the very best freaks and actually had the highest income. So that's kind of one example of how we can look through history back at these communities of people with disabilities. Disability, of course, is a diversity category as well, as is suggested by the structure of the ODS and the RDI and a variety of other different units here at Emory that have lots of letters in them that recognize that diversity is an interactive and intersectional category. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute because it's really the key point for what we're doing here today. Also, disability, of course, and this is one of the things I'm most interested in, not of course. Disability is the subject of the arts, and I have some examples of that. I like to put together disability and art because it's a combination of two words that are not very often put together. And so I've been doing quite a bit of work on that. The last way of thinking about disability that I've listed here under what is disability studies, is to understand disability as a medical pathology. And that's what might be called the majority way of understanding disability, in the sense that at this particular moment in history, in the egalitarian world, if you will, disability is understood as largely a personal misfortune and a medical problem. And this is part of what disability studies is trying to expand. So, now for the pictures. To elaborate this, I mentioned to you that one of the most important aspects of disability studies is to take a look at disability when there aren't really disabled people present. In other words, to see how the concept of disability circulates. And concepts often circulate as metaphors. So here's just a really interesting example of disability as metaphor. And of course, what metaphors do is they help us express ideas, and they help us think, and they help us understand one another. So when disability circulates, or race or gender circulate as in the metaphorical world, they have a kind of sub-narrative way of making us understand one another. So here's a perfect example of disability as metaphor that we might not notice. In the New York Times here, as recently as February of 2009, we have a really interesting disability metaphor, and that is it's a critique, as you might well imagine here, of the Republican Party, which is why we have an elephant here. And the assertion is that the Republican Party is without vision. and that the Republican Party is without vision is represented here by a stereotype of blindness, that is to say, the blind beggar on the street corner, complete with selling pencils, the tin cup, and the dark glasses. What's interesting here, of course, is that what tends to get lost is the stereotypical reference, and what tends to get brought forward is the negative representation. And in some ways, of course, this representation, this cartoon caricature, is a reference to the figure of the blind beggar, which is a very important historical figure because beggars, especially blind beggars, were one of the few groups or instantiations of people with disabilities who were out in the public sphere because they could be on street corners doing begging. And this is the the 1916 really famous picture called Blind by the American photographer Paul Strand, which represents this figure of the blind beggar. I want to talk a little bit about disability and race, disability and gender. Those aren't really very accurate terms in the sense that one of the most important aspects of disability studies and disability as a category of critical analysis is that it allows us to deepen our understanding and complicate our understanding of these other social systems and categories that we work with all together. Largely because disability is a social category that we often don't think a lot about, so it brings up new ways of thinking about social identity and being in the world, and also because it is a very fluid category that people can move in and out of in a way that other categories tend to be imagined and often experienced as a bit more fixed. Disability, of course, is also a cross-category category in the sense that all races have and are subject to disability, and gender, of course, is a cross-disability category as well. But there's some interesting work that is done on specifically the intersection of race and disability and how it's represented. Here are two examples. One is a kind of example from the work that I have done. This is a photograph. I'm interested in representation of human beings in the world. A photograph of young boys who would, in the medical discourse, be diagnosed or be in the diagnostic category of vitiligo, which has been in the news a lot in relation to Michael Jackson. But in the discourse of the 19th century freak shows, these young men become spotted boys. They become racialized primitives. So you have a really interesting confluence of the kinds of differences that we imagine as disability, at least now, and the kinds of differences that we imagine as race represented in these entertainment photographs from the 19th century. A more contemporary example of the way race and disability come together is a politicized photograph that appeals to social justice by displaying disability as stop. 1 minute. Okay, well, that's fine. Let me move. Anyway, this is a picture of someone from Sierra Leone and the civil war in that area in which the amputation of limbs was used as one of the military tactics. I'll just finish up with a little bit about disability and gender. I think this is a great set of images. Because, of course, thinking about gender in terms of disability and thinking about disability in terms of gender helps us read how these categories operate in the world. And this is illustrated by these two matching ads for wheelchairs, which excessively display the stereotypes that we think of as masculinity and femininity in the context of disability. And what's interesting about these, of course, is that disability is imagined as an attenuation of one's sexuality and certainly one's sexual membership in the world. And so the ad for wheelchairs that features the man is an attempt to remasculinize the man with tattoos and hockey sticks and muscles. And the image on the right is an attempt to re-feminize the woman who's a wheelchair user by having her in this submissive position, tipped over, laying down, looking quite available and ready for sexual encounter. So it's really an interesting pairing. I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I guess that's what one's supposed to say to start with. My name's Gyan Pandey. I teach, I research and write a little bit and teach history here in Emory. And though I have to say that many of my students and colleagues sometimes don't recognize that that's what I'm doing. That's all I need to say about myself. I do want to take half a minute, though, to thank the RDI leadership, the Provost's office, and all of you for being here. And I'm just astonished at the people who are still here at this late in the afternoon. I also have to take 10 seconds to say I have to leave at 4:20 for a student's prospectus defense across in the anthropology department. So this is going to be a one-off in Leslie's sort of terms. You know, I just say what I feel like saying and then I disappear, which may sound like an advantage, but actually I feel a little sorry about that because I would have loved to have had responses to the few things that I will say. I thanked the RDI initiative particularly because it's concerned with race and difference. Quite pointedly, it's concerned with more than race and other forms of stigmatizing difference. And I want to think about some of those other forms of stigmatizing difference. I want to do so first by saying, I guess I'm the sole representative of the old colonies of Asia and Africa, and I'm here speaking today. Colonialism is a large part of what I'm talking about, and the kind of difference that is produced by colonialism of this modern kind. When I came to Emory a few years ago, one of the first things that I began to do here was to try and encourage a conversation between scholars of the United States, people working on North America, and scholars of South Asia, people particularly working on India. And around, this is a terribly late hour to introduce new terms, but around a term called subalternity. And I mentioned RDI because one of the planks that we've been concerned with in subalternity, in the RDI project, is subalternity and difference. And subalternity in general, just I'll say it very quickly, refers to relations of dominance and subordination, a hierarchical ordering of economic, political, cultural power, that kind of thing. But its relationship to other forms of difference, it seems to me, has been of some importance. The conversation between scholars of India and scholars of the US, which has now produced, we've produced an anthology called Subaltern Citizens and Their Histories, Investigations from India and the USA. That conversation was interesting and I think important because in some senses, the feeling was, and the feeling might remain, that subalternity, whatever that is, really refers to those parts of the world. You know, poverty and its kinds of problems, caste, which is not a term that's been used here, but outcasting people from a society. You know, these are problems of somewhere else. Even discrimination of a systemic kind, systemic poverty, systemic discrimination, systemic malpractice. These are problems of somewhere else, even though Katrina and the Bush elections and so much else already showed us, you know, and much long before that, there was a great deal of evidence to talk about those kinds of issues and those kinds of problems here. In any event, so we proceeded with these conversations on subaltern citizens and their histories in North America and South Asia. We have gone on following workshops in this university. Colleagues said, when do we have these conversations in India? This last summer, a set of Emory faculty, we went out to 4 different cities in India and had 4 one-day workshops on issues of subalternity and difference, the relationship between those terms, if you like. And those were extraordinary conversations, extraordinary in part, and in large part, I think, simply because the location was so different, because the knowledge, the perspectives, the disciplinary background that people bring to the same questions, the same issues that we are discussing here, actually makes the debate and the findings appear different. And it's important to have that conversation, work with it. So, and we're going on to produce out of that an anthology on the issue of subalternity and difference. I've told you what I've said, what I feel about subalternity. We're focusing in this particular volume on the question of difference and how it has been articulated in academic and political work. And difference, it seems to me, continues to be used for all that in this one-day workshop here. We have been talking about differences of so many different kinds and differences that need to be recognized as emerging at particular points, becoming politically sensitive at particular points and so on. We've had vulnerability, disability, new kinds of difference foregrounded late in the afternoon. It seems to me that the notion of difference that we continue to work with is to a very large extent one that is a difference found in the nation state. It is articulated in the European quest for nationhood in the 19th century, and it takes the form, paradigmatically, it takes the form of the deviant minority and the emancipation, assimilation of the deviant minority, the Jewish question. And it, in some senses, all difference, whether it is man versus woman, black versus white, Brahman versus Dalit, ex-untouchables in India, what other examples do we have? White Australian versus Aboriginals, you know, whatever examples we have, it's the deviant minority and their emancipation and their assimilation that becomes the question. I put it to you that the paradigm case here is that of a center, the nation state, and the deviant within it, the Jews in 19th century Europe, the Muslims in the late 20th century and on from that in much of the world. So the Jewish question remains the paradigm case here. And what several of us began to investigate was, what happens if the paradigm case of difference is taken to be not the Jew-Muslim, not the deviant cultural minority, already classed as different, as fully constituted, but the African-American, the Dalit, the ex-untouchable in India, or, to stretch the point a little, woman. Because recall that these are all examples of difference which are foregrounded. These are somehow radical alterity is being declared here, okay? What if the paradigm case of difference is not the Jew-Muslim, but the black, the Dalit, ex-untouchable, or woman? And I think if one takes that as the paradigm case, a number of consequences follow, a number of steps are necessitated straight away, which do not come up with the Jewish question. One of the first of these is that the minority is not fully constituted from the start. The minority is not even necessarily recognized as minority. Its deviance is not given. Women, you know, in what sense? Are women a minority, right? Are Dalits in India, the ex-untouchables or the ex-untouchable groups who are very widespread, are fundamentally the laboring poor. They are landless laborers, they are poor peasants, they are people who migrated into the towns and worked. They are in no sense deviant, except that they are oppressed, right? And the Dalits have themselves, in the 20th century particularly, constituted themselves into a political minority, marked their difference. How they have marked their difference becomes a very important and interesting issue. So one of the first things that happens, I suggest, by shifting the paradigm case, is that we come to recognize that minorities or difference is not given from the start. It is not natural, it's not biological, but it's not even historically always present. It is constituted. It is fought for in so many different ways. I think, too, that these examples show something else. The mark of African-American existence in this country, of Dalit existence in India, and again, pushing the point a little bit, of women's existence in much of the world, is what marks the difference is dominance and subordination to a very large extent. It is relations of dominance and subordination, of inequality in the sense of discrimination, disprivilege, of not an equal playing field, right? And given that, the separation of subalternity and difference becomes very difficult. In these particular instances, we can see that, in fact, difference is constituted by the hierarchical ordering of economic, political, and cultural power, right? So subalternity and difference, we have suggested, are terms that should be looked at together. And their intersection and their interplay and the way in which they're deployed will actually produce rather different accounts, both of subalternity and of difference. And just to illustrate that, in the book that we've just published called Subaltern Citizens and Their Histories, I wrote this about subalternity and difference in a small section. I said that for a very long time in human history, for the dominant classes, for ruling powers and dominant groups, difference, the pronouncement of difference, has been a way of organizing subalternity. By pronouncing something as different, you actually naturalize unequal relations and power. So, men are not different, women are, right? In India, Hindus are not different, Muslims are. Brahmins are not different, Dalits, ex-untouchables are. In Australia, astonishingly, white Australians are not different, native Australians are. There's an astonishing statement about what is different. Different is those, it is originally said, different are those who are not in the mainstream, who are not at the center, who are deviant. I put it to you, different are those who are not in power, right? And once you've made that argument, then the next step, and the very interesting step, of course, is the late 20th century has seen the appropriation of the language of difference by oppositional groups, by women, by sexual minorities, by Dalits, as I said, seeking to constitute themselves into a minority in order to be able to fight that battle against those who proclaim them different, right? The politics of this is very complicated and must remain complicated. Our charge, in some senses, as scholars and as concerned citizens, must be to say that the mainstream, the center, the nation state, none of this is given from the start. This is constituted, this is produced, and it is produced by privilege and power that is inherited or conquered or established in various different ways. So, a point that's been made several times over here is the point I would just like to finish with, since I've been told I only have 2 minutes left. I would, if I had the time, talk about the many different kinds of difference which are ignored. I would also point to the fact that some differences become consequential, become noticed, become public, and therefore become difference at certain sorts of times. Our task as scholars must be to examine and to underline this process of the making of difference, the making of minorities, and the pretensions of those claims to being the non-deviant, the center, the mainstream, the norm, as it were. Okay, thank you.
I feel like I'm back in tax class. Yes, Tyrone.
I I thought this was very stimulating, and in many ways, because I think it interrupts or attempts to some of the concepts that we've been given. So questions of race indifference, what does that mean? And so, in particular, I guess my question is really for Martha or Deanne, and it's, I guess, analytically, I guess, there seems to be what underlies some of the argumentation that you're making, that more fundamental material. And the reason why this sort of resonated with me was what was invoked a number of times in your conceptualization was we're ignoring more material inequities by sort of thinking about gender, thinking about race, that there are these other fundamental material inequalities that get unexplored or sort of unexamined in meaningful ways. And I'm thinking specifically here about some of what you said, Martha. And so I guess the question really is how does vulnerability, because this develops as you sort of talk about out of a critique of how the law deals with difference in important ways. And I guess the question I have is, if we use the nation, we take for a moment, we take serious the nation-state boundary, are there examples in other parts of the globe where the concept of vulnerability actually plays out? That is, where the state or the law sort of understands that many people are vulnerable, or are there places that sort of do that better than the United States, which is, in some ways, the law is shaped by this kind of ideology of individualism, right? That's partly what we're fighting an uphill battle against.
I'm glad you asked that, and I'm not going to take this opportunity to deliver the next half of my paper. But I'm tempted. I view this project as an all-American project to really focus us on the collective, to focus us on the state responsibility. It's how we can make claims on the state. And you asked about other societies. I think that in thinking about this from an American perspective, it seemed clear to me as a practical matter that referring to international human rights in order to argue that there is a right to education, there's a right to housing, there's a right to health care, there's a right to food, none of which exist in American law, incidentally. But to make those arguments, you cannot say, oh, and that's incidentally what the French are doing. You have to have an all-American kind of argument, and so what this argument, if I had gotten through it, would be is a way to focus us on the way our institutions are structured along lines that privilege some and disadvantage others, and say, challenge the state to make our promise of equal opportunity and equal access real. By considering the context. And I think it's stronger than the discrimination model because it really focuses us on state institutions. Individual actors are irrelevant, actually, in the analysis. There's a focus at the institutional level, at the state level, and you don't need malice, you don't need ill will, you don't need discrimination. Inequality is in and of itself enough to prompt action.
But isn't that just a problem with the fact that the law focuses on intent as opposed to some of these other sort of broader notions of exclusion and discrimination?
Well, the way we understand equality, it can't do anything else but focus on intent, and that's why pushing our concepts of equality has to change.
But I would say that's exactly where I was going. That the law that looks at intent could have done it a different way. It could have said anytime there is a disparate impact, which is inequality, But that's not how the law went. The law went, we want intent, we want to find a bad actor, and in the absence of that, you don't have a case.
And there's a distinction between formal equality, which is what we have, rule equality, and substantive equality, which is what we don't have. And it's how we get, or can we get, as a country. Again, I'm talking, and I think I said this initially, about a political culture, and how it is that we can argue for this collective response, this collective responsibility,
Europe had a war, and they, bombs fell on rich people as well as poor people, and they had got this notion to have a more developed social welfare state as a result. Are we beginning to see some cracks in the rugged American individualism? I hope so.
Just say that, since there was a competitive element in your question, and something addressed to me as well, I'll just say that, in fact, there are, of course, states that are concerned with these questions, and there are already policy issues and major political debates around. In India, there are vulnerable populations that are identified as such. Backward castes, historically disprivileged communities who will be given support by the state, reservations in education institutions, public services, and so on. And so there's a huge fight to be recognized as a historically disprivileged community, even amongst people who would traditionally never have wanted that kind of thing. It's a very complicated, murky business. I just want to say, in relation to the other question that you asked, that some of these presentations were drawing us back to the material conditions of minorities in various kinds. I think that may well be part of what we need to do. I just want to say that different indices are invoked at different times. This is the point that I would stress is simply that the process, the making of these differences, the making of the minorities, the marking off of particular populations as deviant, let's just use that word, is what requires our attention. Right? And then the possibility of using those state practices and state language to overturn some of the very policies that they have led.
One more question? Yes.
This day has been really wonderful because it's been a kind of counterpoint between research on race and difference and then thinking about the institutional practices of where that scholarship goes on. And so I guess I'd invite you to talk about your own sort of institutional situations and where, how you see your theorizing of race and difference fitting into the institution. I thought there was a kind of thread that ran throughout the panel. Ian said, well, I'm in a history department, but I'm not sure that my colleagues recognize what I do as history. Rosemarie said, well, I started in literary studies, but I'm now kind of elsewhere doing something else. But actually, the person I'm really interested to ask this question to is of you, Dorothy. How is your work on race and tax law received within the field of tax law, and how does that conversation go?
I kiss you for that question.
Well, I had a hint that you might be interested in talking about that.
And the reason I'm writing this book for the public is because tax academics don't want to talk about race. We'll talk about class because we have a progressive tax rate structure, so we get that. But don't talk to me about race, because this is what I get a lot. Dorothy, your work is irrelevant because everybody knows poor people don't pay a lot in taxes and blacks are disproportionately poor, so why are you talking about this stuff? It's like, hello? So I write op-eds. I don't talk to the tax bar at all because it's a particularly frustrating and not fruitful discussion. So I will talk to critical race theorists who humor me. They're like, oh, Dorothy does tax stuff. Let's have her come and talk to her. So, but what I want to do is change the discourse on tax reform, which is why I'm writing this book, which is why I've spent over 12 years studying it and just not giving up simply because some tax law professor says, I don't think your work is relevant. Okay, I guess we'll end it there. Let's thank the panel.
Troy Duster is a professor of sociology and the director of the Institute for History of the Production of Knowledge at New York University. He's also the Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1970. His many years of service at Berkeley included the founding and directing for 17 years of the Institute for the Study of Social Change. His research and writing have ranged from the sociology of law, science, deviance, inequality, race, and education. He has authored or co-authored hundreds of journal articles and book chapters. His first book, The Legislation of Morality, Drugs, Crime, and Law, showed that when the demographics of opiate addiction shifted from predominantly white and middle class to predominantly poor, disreputable groups, so did its definition and the law surrounding it. While for the former group, it was considered a health problem to be dealt with privately by physicians, for the latter, it was redefined as a crime problem to be dealt with by the state and by imprisonment. His more recent books include a seminal Back Toward Eugenics and the critically acclaimed Whitewashing Race, The Myth of a Colorblind Society. His research has yielded a number of honors and awards. I won't bother naming them all. He's also past president of the American Sociological Association and has served on committees for the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and is chair of the Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues Committee of the Human Genome Project. In his work on the Human Genome Project, he played a crucial role, reminding the geneticists in the room, much to their dismay, that while they were prepared to declare that race didn't exist, it remained very much a social reality. He continues to draw important critical attention to the attempts of those in arenas ranging from the pharmaceutical industry to criminal justice to reinscribe the biology of race by, for example, using DNA markers linked to ancestral origins to attempt genetic explanations of crime patterns. While he is obviously brilliant and distinguished, he is also warm and gracious. A recent feature written about him described him as an extraordinary blend of playful and passionate, humorous, upbeat, charming, and graceful. I told you I love doing this stuff. A cosmopolitan at home and in the world. I couldn't put it any better myself. Please join me in welcoming here.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to address this group. I've been given two tasks. The first one is to make use of my experience at Berkeley as an institute director and say some things which might be relevant to the RDI and its capacity to rethink and reformulate and come up with some ideas about what to do in the next short period as it develops as an institute. My second task is to talk about some new research on race and difference, work that I regard as sort of vanguard and a harbinger of things to come, and the kind of work which I think the RDI might be very well marked to take a closer look at. And my third task is, after 7 hours, to keep you awake. And we'll see if I can do that. So as you heard from Amanda, for nearly 2 decades, I directed the Institute for Research at Berkeley called Social Change. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that happened. But because Keith did such a good job this morning of describing institutional, organizational building issues, I think I'm going to keep that relatively short and spend more of my time talking about the new research. But let me just give you a quick picture and maybe draw the relevance to what might be of use and interest here to the RDI. Okay, 1965, California, Watts in particular, goes up. There's the Watts rebellion. The city's in flames. Lots of people are killed. 3 years later, there's the King assassination, 68. And Newark, Detroit, many cities go up in flames. The following year, my colleagues at Berkeley looked around and they said, in the full 9-campus system, not a single institute is concerned with the intellectual or research issues around race as a concept. So shouldn't we have an institute in the whole 9-campus system dealing with race? I mean, after all, this was a period in which the Panthers with Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, were right there in Oakland, and there was no institute studying race. There had been an incident at UCLA, actually a murder on the stage of the university between the Panthers and another group called US. And yet no one in the campus system was studying race. So at this period, Berkeley decided to go ahead and put together a proposal for an institute called Race and Community. Now the problem was that the students who mobilized to have this institute come forward, to come alive, were very militant black students who didn't want to have this institute colonized by another white professor. And so even though Winthrop Jordan, esteemed professor of history, Bob Blauner, professor of sociology, I could name another 4 or 5 people, Larry Levine, any of them could have been legitimate institute directors. The politics of race of that period was such that a white instructor, a white professor, didn't really feel comfortable, didn't want to do it, or wouldn't be permitted by the black students. So they came and asked me, and I said no. I was young, but not that naive. I was at a point in my career in which I was doing my own work, the early book on history of opiates, and I thought it would be an intrusion that I couldn't really focus. And so I said no, and for the next decade, here's what happened to me. A little bit of the demography of Berkeley in that period. There were 1,350 faculty members, only 6 African Americans, and I was the only one in social science. There was Wilkins, the brother, cousin of Roy Wilkins in the law school. There was Satan Webster over in education. There were 3 other people on campus. I was the only professor in the whole the University of California, African American. And so the few black students in, let's say, in political science or philosophy or English would come to me and ask me to be on their doctoral committees. And sympathetic, I would often say yes. So over the next decade, I joined over 24 committees as a faculty member and began seeing how my colleagues were being, were treating how the graduate students were being treated in the various departments. Now, they were pretty much isolated, and that's part of my story. They would therefore come to me and ask me if I would be a supportive person, and I would give them some ideas about how to navigate in that environment. Well, 10 years later, I actually did receive a large research training grant from the NIH to train graduate students. And with that resource, I agreed to bring that money into the Institute for Social Change, which used to be Race and Community, whereas we changed the name for all kinds of reasons, which I won't go into here, but kept the focus on race and difference and in some sense, in class. So here's the way things worked, and I think this may be of some relevance to RDI. So we had this amount of money, funding about a dozen grad students to be trained in social science research. And I was therefore able to get many of my colleagues to bring their research grants into the Institute, and I could lure them in by saying, I'll give you a free research assistant or 2. And here's the way it worked. So the Institute was like the core, and then the spokes were the various projects. The grad students were assigned to my faculty colleagues for their research projects. They'd be on that project for, let's say, 6 months or a year, and then they'd have to come back every 2 or 3 weeks to a meeting to discuss their individual and collective experiences. So over the period of 2 or 3 years of their assistantships, they had lots of training in different projects. Okay. Flash forward about 20 years, it's all over. I leave the directorship, and there's a big party, a big celebration. Over the years, we trained over 82 PhDs of color. Native American, Asian American, Latino, and of course African American. So at this celebration, people came back to talk about their experiences. And this is where I learned something. They didn't talk about how wonderful an instructor I was. That wasn't a part of it. What they talked about was how the Institute had provided for them a kind of remarkable refuge from their isolation in the Department of Political Science. There was one particular student, the first and only female PhD in political science at Berkeley, had been lonely, isolated. She said when she came to the Institute and looked around and saw these dozen or 15 students, most of whom were Native American or Latino or Asian, some whites, she said she found an environment that was supportive, sympathetic, that her intellectual work was being not so much criticized at ground zero, why do that kind of work, but how can we help you? And then person after person would take the stage and give a kind of tearful testimonial to how much this had been important to them in their intellectual life. So it was the movement away from isolation in their departments into this environment. And so possibly there's something in here of some relevance to RDI. I think Emory may have a configuration not quite the same as Berkeley in terms of its racial composition, but my guess is that many grad students in these departments may feel a similar kind of isolation. Okay, now I want to now move on to the issues around research. But before I do that, one more thing. Howie Winant, you may know this, University of California, Santa Barbara, he's a sociologist, just submitted and received a successful grant from the University of California, the Multi-Campus Research Institute, the 10-campus system, $1.7 million for a new institute for race. So what I would suggest, Tyrone and Amanda and others, that you get in touch with Howie. He's been asking for models. He wants to be collaborative. He wants to do research across the country, and he has resources. Okay. All right, so now let me turn to well, I'll try to keep you awake now with some interesting work on what I call the new developments of interest. There has been a fierce debate inside the halls of science on the concept of race. In the last decade, the period after the Human Genome Project ended, you had these two camps developing. Some people would say things like, why, of course, race is a social construct. It's arbitrary, it's whimsical. In Brazil, it's one thing. In the US, it's something else. Caribbean, of course, it's different. You can't have a concept in research which is so highly variable. How are you going to do anything that's really empirically valid? On the other hand, you had another group of people saying, no, we have to keep race as a concept biologically. And here's an example. When the Human Genome Project ended, they decided to do something called the haplotype map. Now, the haplotype map, I'm not going to explain it, just to say that they had already collected samples of DNA from different parts of the population across the world. And the question was, do we leave on those samples the markers that indicate that those samples are from different ethnic and racial groups? And part of the group said, categorically no. Let's take all the markers off. Let's just do the genetics. And the other group said, are you crazy? If we take the markers off and produce results that show different kinds of patterns, people will say, well, how do we know that those people weren't all from Idaho? They weren't all white. How do we know they weren't all from Asia? I mean, we have to know in order to make sense. Thus, the beginning of the double bind. You see? You take the markers off, what have you got? You leave them on, you're in danger of the reinscription of race. That's what the very beginning of this debate. So now, a word or two about how this has played itself out in different departments. Some anthropology departments have gone almost to war over this. So you find people who are doing work, let's say, the cultural studies part of anthropology, the post-structural analysis, will say things like, well, there are many identities, and race is only one of them. There are multiple identities. It's arbitrary, whimsical. Why should this particular master narrative be one which is privileged? You got the picture? They're talking to their physical anthropologist colleagues who are now doing work at the DNA level, which I'll talk about in a moment. And these colleagues are saying, are you kidding? I mean, we have now the DNA showing different patterns of different populations. It's not just a narrative. And places like Stanford split. Department's physical anthropology is over here as opposed to cultural anthropology over here. Places at like Columbia, Washington, all had this huge debate. And I wouldn't say that race was the central concept in the debate, but it played an important role. Some of this begins with what I'll call the Icelandic trek, where people decided to go up to Iceland Why? Because you heard earlier in the day from Paula the notion of this out of Africa. Some people went even further out of Africa and went all the way up to Iceland, and they isolated, homogeneous. This is the quote, white population. This is 6 centuries of almost no contact below Scandinavia. So the assumption by the part of Kari Stephenson and others who wanted to do this research was, we go up here not because they're, quote, pure and white, but because they're homogeneous genetically. They invite us to come and take their DNA and do the analysis. Within another couple of years, there was a reaction at Howard University where my colleagues said, well, let's have some African-American DNA, 25,000 samples of African-Americans. And then the Estonians wanted a DNA data bank. And then you turned around and all of a sudden there were all these developments. So, now, while this part of the story I think is well known, I'm going to provide you with what I'll call some new developments, some new evidence. This is playing itself out internationally. Now remember, it begins with Iceland, saying that they are more or less homogeneous. That's how it begins. Now, African Americans, of course, not homogeneous, but they wanted to have their own data bank. What's happened now is that across many parts of the globe, different countries are saying, we want to collect our own national DNA data banks. Why? Well, what's the National Genome Medicine? Quite the opposite of Iceland. They're saying there, we want to capture the diversity, the difference inside of Mexico. We have a uniqueness because we have a combination of Indian, Mestizo, Spanish background, and so on. In other words, we want to do in Mexico our own research to indicate just how distinctive we are as a national group. Something counterintuitive is happening here, isn't it? So here we have the people getting their DNAs taken, a crusade to map the Mexican people. Look at this language. If we don't carry out our own studies to understand ourselves, and well, others are going to do it, and they may have their own populations, their own problems. And here's a really important point. If they come to get this information, they'll make us dependent on them. We must develop our own genome project. India. This is the work of my colleague, former student, Rua Benjamin, at the University of California, Los Angeles currently. And I borrowed these slides from her. With her permission, she wants me to tell you about this, what's happening in India. Remarkably heterogeneous population. But what are they doing? The Indian Genome Variation Consortium. And here in this map, you'll see a kind of framing of the problem that looks like 18th century System Natura, What's his name? Carlos Linnaeus. You just heard about him this morning. Well, look at these categories: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Australoid, Negroid, Negrito. This is the year 2009, Indian mapping. And what's the reason? Well, here's hot off the press. David Reich up at MIT, the Broad Institute, and his colleagues. September 2009. Can't get more recent than that. What have they done? Genotyped 132 samples in 25 different groups, 15 states, 6 languages. What are we going to do? We're going to compare upper lower castes. Too bad our colleague just left. He would be interested in this. He doesn't know about this. This is hot off the press. So what are they doing? Using this kind of technology, yielding data for over 500,000 SNPs. They're merging their data with the haplotype map, the HGP, and now the question is, for what? In behalf of what? Well, just like the Mexicans, the argument is the internal differentiation is going to be distinctive. We have to have our own map. They're concerned about viral piracy. And here's some language. So they said that our debates centered around, of course, the meaning of all this. They think they're just sort of mapping and sequencing and distributing information. And here's where we come to the focus upon new research and interdisciplinarity. The fact here is rather transparent that what's going on is people feeling that if you communicate these data out by different, quote, groups, whether it's disease differences, disparities, whether it's what they might call later on some, learned about responses to drugs, it's going to have an impact. So here we have a situation where increasingly in the last short period, different nation states are now asserting that they're going to get their own genome projects. Now look at this map. Look at this development. At the bottom, it's just shown you Mexico and India. But here we have China, Beijing Institute of Genomics, the Thais, their own discovery project, Egypt, Gambia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Iran, human genome, and so on. Well, lurking in the background is big pharmaceutical. The emerging 7 are these, and almost in order of interest to biotechnology. PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates 20% of all global sales by 2025. In India alone, they expect 73 million diabetic sufferers, treatments, $420 per person, $30 billion in sales. Hey, things start to take shape. Let me step back for a moment to give you the scientific or the combination of intellectual scientific backdrop to this. And you'll see that you can't separate that out from the politics of money. This is an article that was published just a few years ago. And look at the language of the title, Pharmacogenetics and Ancestry, Implications for Drug Development and Global Health. Not distribution of nutrients, no, drug development. And now here is some language from that article. The Pan-Asian Consortium, this is in response to what I was saying earlier about Estonia, Iceland, everybody's going to have their own genomic. Now look at this language. We're going to have a consortium. It's almost boggling of the mind. We're going to combine China, Indonesia, India, Japan, Malaysia, to do what? A Pan-Asian SNP consortium. What would you think that these different nations had in common? Except a common sense rendering of something coming out of the 18th century. Now look at the goal. To uncover the breadth of diversity genetically, to focus on genomic information of particular relevance to Asia. Now this point I really want to emphasize, this language of the last quote. You see, up until now we've been hearing things about how we're going to have individualized treatment, right? We're going to map and sequence, but ultimately when we get to pharmacogenomics, we're going to have individualized medicine. You go into your doctor, give her or him the information from your genome, and then they're going to particularly prescribe medicines relevant to your particular configuration. That's the language of the emerging, that's the hope. Now we look at this language. And now we're saying something quite different. We're going to deliver medicine less and less to individuals, to population aggregates, to groups. After the project was completed, Human Genome Project was completed, it had two components. One was Celera, that was the private sector, and the other was the public sector. This particular quote I love because it sort of captures the essence of what happened. Now, they had Craig Venters, the white person's DNA. They then take a collection of Koreans and their DNA, and they say, now, based upon this particular history of that, we're now going to show you we've mapped the Korean genome. Nationalism, ethnicity. Now, I think I told you that at the very beginning of the HapMap, the debate was over, do we leave the markers on? And here's what happened. Just 5 years later, after that debate took place, and you can see who won, the markers are on. They began to report data out which showed differences. And of course, those differences were interpreted as being a reflection of the essential character of those different categories. So now when the Han Chinese, numbering only about, I don't know, 20 or 25, African descent was only about 18 or 20, and so forth, but they found differences. And Science magazine reported it out in 2005, and here's what the title was: Whole Genome Patterns of Common DNA Variation in 3 Diverse Human Populations. Why were they diverse populations? Well, because common sense understandings of the taxonomic system made them different. If they left the markers off, they wouldn't have had any way of knowing. But that was a double bind. Here's the unfolding of the research project, and it's going to have a parallel to what happened with Bidil. I'm not going to talk about Bidil. I'm going to talk about this particular experience with Iressa, a late-stage cancer drug, which this company decided to pursue. It was going to be a worldwide blockbuster drug. But we've begun to discover in the last period that blockbuster drugs are less and less likely, and now what we want to do is to find drugs which are focused upon particular population aggregates. So it began with this huge sample, not racialized, not ethnic, just going to do this late-stage cancer drug. And it was going to be $1 billion annual sales. Turned out that it was a bust. It had no effect of any consequence, except they went back into the data, and they found that among Asians, Iressa seemed to have a 6 to 8 month extension for late-stage cancer survivors. So what happened? An announcement occurred in the newspapers. We're going to take this drug east. Here's what the head said. As we invent more precise drugs to target gene causes of diseases, they may uncover ethnic-specific responses, like Iressa. So what you're seeing here is the inadvertent molecular reinscription of racial taxonomies through the lens of big pharmaceutical and pharmacogenomics. We're going to bring to you medicines for, quote, your kind of people. The Black Seminoles are another harbinger of things to come. And here's, in my remaining time, let me just spend a little time talking about what I think is going to happen around this area. And if I have a few minutes, I may get into forensics. But let's first go with how you know who you are. This is an echo from an earlier part of the morning. When you're just sending your DNA up to the web to see what percentage ancestry, that's called recreational. But when there's money involved, now it's serious. So Seminole Nation was told in 2000 there's going to be a new kind of assessment of just who is entitled to some of this money. How to divide up 56 million? Now the question is, are you really a Seminole? Or are you a black Seminole? Should they use Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA? I can't get into the details here, I don't have enough time. But just to say quickly, Y chromosome takes you along this path, the 2, 4, 8, 16, okay, 32, all the way back. Y chromosome takes you back 1, 2, 3. So that by, let's say, the 4th, 5th generation, we're talking about 32 parents. As you heard this morning, Y chromosome gets you one of them. Why risk that? The same for mitochondria. Okay, so the question was, what are we going to do? Now the Cree Nation, 2004, 127 million casino in Edmonton's approved to be split amongst the tribe members. And now look at this language. Over here on the far right, can you see in the back of the room? Can you read? Otherwise, I can read it to you. It says, with our Orchard DNA test, determining Native American lineage for tribal enrollment is fast, simple, and non-invasive. We provide irrefutable results through assessment which is scientific for alleged relationships that are biological. Contact Orchard to find out whether or not you're entitled to some of this money. So my colleague Kimberly Tallbear at UC Berkeley now has done remarkably good work on this area, Native American research projects. To what extent should Native Americans submit to what she calls the adjudication of themselves through the DNA? Should they use these kinds of devices to say yes or no? Well, it's one thing, when, again, talking about just who you think you are. But now the question is, are you able to possibly turn this into who you are in terms of financial resources? This project, available to almost anyone, wants to find out, quote, who you are. And here's the language of the shrinking population that turns my colleague, Kimberly Tallbear, livid. She says, why are they worried suddenly about disappearing Native Americans? It has to do with, partly, of course, the notion that we're going to understand human evolution, but partly I think it's got to do with something called resources and development of drugs. Biopiracy is one of the big issues that's been hovering over this debate for the last 10 years. So, do I have 5 more minutes? Okay. All right, so I want to now turn to the other technology of how we get to understand why people would believe that a DNA marker or several would determine whether or not they're really from a particular background. All right, we have the Y chromosome, male, 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 all the way back. That's one way of doing it. But you only get 1/4 or 1/8 or 1/16 or 2/54 by that technology. Or mitochondrial, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4. The further you go back, you only get one person out of all these possibilities. And yet everybody in this whole map that I could show you, everyone is equally contributing to your DNA. So Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA markers are going to give you only a very small part of your history, just what you heard this morning from Paul. Okay. So they have another technology called ancestral informative markers. And the question is, how did these markers get to be regarded as population specific? The first reports in 1997 claimed that these markers were specific to a population. Shriver is now recanted and he doesn't use that language anymore. But he does lay claim to the notion that these markers will predict whether or not you're from a certain, quote, ancestry. Okay. So what are these markers? They call them admixture percentages. And let me stop the B. And just tell you a little bit about this technology. So rather than getting into the details, we have 3 billion base pairs, all of us. 99.9% are exactly alike in this room, any 2 people or any 2 people in the world. Exactly the same, 99.9. Up until 2000, that was seen as why we needed to have the map and the sequence, because anybody's DNA would do. But in 2000, we turned to difference. We turned to the machinery to look for that 0.1%. And all that I've shown you so far has to do with the capacity of the technology to look at that 0.1% difference. Why would that be of interest? Well, there are 3 billion base pairs, and only 0.1% that's different. That still means there are at least 7 to 10 million points of difference between any 2 people in this room. I'll repeat that. In this room, any 2 people, or in the world, they can find 7 million SNPs of difference. Any 2 people. So beginning in the year 2000, the technology shifted. let's go over and find out what makes people, or rather what the differences are. If you have a computer program, there's one called structure, and you saw this morning one of the outcomes of that program. And you tell the machinery, here we have collections of DNA, go into this and then sort. If I take this room and say, people in the first 2/3, I'll call you group A, and I'll tell the machinery, go in and find at least 40% of the markers that I designate are different from groups back here, group B and group C. The computer will do that with 3 billion base pairs, with 3 million at least SNPs. You tell the computer program, take group A and find markers that are different at 40% level than those in groups B and C. You're group C, okay? A, B, and C. The computer will do that. And you would, of course, conclude appropriately and correctly, that research makes no sense. Why would you do that? Unless I told you that everybody in group A was white, group B was Asian, and group C was African American. Then you'd say, they have found differences in the DNA. These ancestry markers must mean something. Okay, why is this not hypothetical? The technology is proprietarial, not open to investigation. We don't know, for example, what the sample size. Let's start with sub-Saharan Africa. 775 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. What was the sampling procedure that was used by this technology? 1,000 people? Maybe 5,000, maybe 20,000. But where did they sample? East Africa, West Africa, South Africa? What part? And why would you believe that they had sampled in such a way, when they give you the Ames markers at 40%, that means that that quote is the 100%. Let me back up from that. If someone tells you that you're 15% of something, what does that mean? They must know what 100% is. Yeah? Now, when I pose this question to Shriver and his group, what they will acknowledge quickly is that, of course, it's a statistical frequency that they've arbitrarily designated. So in the scientific debates that we have, they will acknowledge that this is an arbitrary notion. Let's take Native Americans. 485 tribes of the Tribal Council, at least 485. Why would you think that this technology would sample even more than 30 of those tribes, much less 485? So what they're doing is sampling a certain number of tribes, telling the machine, go in and find the markers at 40% admixture, and then that'll be our, quote, 100% Native American. You then take your DNA up to the web, and you say, what percent Native American am I? And they actually tell Oprah Winfrey, nada. They tell Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, nada. In other words, we're dealing here with a kind of a gigantic statistical smoke and mirrors until they open up the technology for scrutiny. Until we know exactly what the software is telling us about those aims, we have no way of saying whether or not Oprah is or not Zulu. We can't know that until we open the technology up. However, very sophisticated people, and I'm closing here, people with a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, watch these programs, and they conclude that, oh, Chris Tucker actually goes to Africa, to that part of Africa, and he finds his ancestors. No, what they found was a match on the Y chromosome of a mitochondrial of a frequency in that part of Africa. And then it's concluded that that's who he is, or that's who his ancestors were. The ancestry markers, therefore, upon closer scrutiny by those who are doing research across disciplines, who understand enough genetics, not a lot, just enough to know that they're using a proprietary program, not open to public scrutiny. Now, my colleague, Dwayna Fulwiley at Harvard, actually got access. She went into 2 or 3 of these labs. And my figures here come from her research. So there are people in anthropology doing lab work in what they call their tribe. the tribe of those who are trying to find the genetic basis of these kinds of markers. She's finding these results. And what I'm suggesting here is that in the next decade, be on the lookout for more and more of these developments. I have no time here to go into forensics. I'll simply close by saying, in the next decade, my prediction is that you'll see a lot more of this notion of ancestry markers, ethnic identification, a la CSI, crime scene investigation, that will have more of an impact than some of this work we're now talking about with pharmacogenomics. Now that's a dire prediction, but you'll see in 5 or 10 years whether I was right. Thank you. Any questions, concerns, reflections? Yes.
Well, it's another question. I'd love to hear you just take a few minutes to talk about some of the forensic implications. Those are even more dire.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, if you look at CSI, and almost everybody does. I've lectured on this topic in several locations where I just rhetorically said, well, who here has watched CSI? Singapore, 90% of the students. Vienna, 100%. I forget exactly, 3 or 4 other places where I thought, no, CSI is universal, everything. So here's the idea. You go to the crime scene, you get the DNA, and if there's a match, you know, gotcha, right? That's the idea. Well, let's be fair. Let's be fair. When you have a mismatch with the DNA at a crime scene, you have the real capacity for exoneration. So let's celebrate the Innocence Project and its capacity in the last 7 years to exonerate 225 people, of whom 18 were on death row. But let's not mistake a mismatch with a match. A mismatch is when the DNA crime scene just doesn't work, and that's definitive. But a match, that means we have something called 13 loci out of the many possibilities, 13 loci that we're using. And then if you get, quote, a random match, a connection that's at the crime scene, someone's in a big data bank, the CODIS National Data Bank, over 7 million people in that bank by now, 7 million people. You go to the crime scene, you get some DNA, you put it in the machine in the morning, and it clicks up and it says, okay, we've got a match. It matches John Puckett's DNA, 71-year-old Californian for a rape murder that occurred 30 years ago. We've got a match. They haul him in. The prosecution says you're under arrest for the rape and murder of so-and-so. They have a match. And then they go to the jury. This is a true story. And they say, you know, the chances of a random match probability are 1 in 1.6 million. The jury says, whoa, that's pretty impressive. And so the chances of a conviction go up, don't they? However, upon closer inspection, Becca Barlow, who did this research in California, and one of the Puckett team, had training in genetics. And she had heard at a conference that in Arizona, the database of 65,000 had produced something like 70 or 80 matches in the population in prison with a particular DNA sample. So she subpoenaed and got access to the material, and not only did she find out that it was 122 matches at 9 loci, something like 14 matches at 10 or 12, and so on. In other words, what they're telling you in the CSI programming, and indeed what juries are telling you, is we got this match, we got our man, usually, got our man. What they're not telling you is that random match probability is only one technology, and it should not be used in CSI investigations. That random match probability goes way down when we're talking about matching. A new piece of research is out. I can give you the references to it, but we're going to find out more and more that this is problematic. So what did the FBI do when Becca Barlow subpoenaed? They told their agents all around the country to be very careful of this research. Don't let any more people have an inquiry. So then she tried to subpoena the California authorities for their database, and was blocked by by the courts, by the judges, and the FBI came out and said, if you continue this procedure, we will take Arizona and California off of the CODIS. So they threatened both states, in particular Arizona, and in the last period, things have not gotten any better. My point is, in this next period, watch out for more and more challenges to the notion that random match probability is definitive. We're going to see more and more challenges to this, and the relevance to race is transparent. It is transparent, in case you haven't noticed who's in the criminal justice system. Keith.
Well, I follow-up question on the interesting story of how probability and difference as reflected through probabilities get translated through these different processes, whether it's courts, whether it's popular culture, like CSI, or through Oprah as not probability at all, but certainty. I mean, in a way, if you could say to Oprah, there is a 15% chance that you are 23%, which is more closer to the truth.
Yes.
But so I'm interested in your comment on the way in which a lot of the challenge and difference has to do with making this the story of probability more of a central story rather than the simple one.
Indeed, I'm sure you noticed in my last remarks about the FBI that they're deeply concerned about this. They do not want this challenge to go forward, and everything they can to block the investigation. Now remember, in forensic science, I'm not talking about science. Science is all about replication, validation. And so you say you've discovered cold fusion, well then let's have somebody else go discover cold fusion, right? But with criminal justice, one company, proprietary, owns the software, doesn't let you know what that software is all about, and claims a person's chances of being in a random match are 1 in 1.6 million, okay? So if you're a jury, or even worse, and this I guess comes to Amanda's point, what I really think is happening here, remember, most of these never get to the jury. 95% of all convictions are from a plea bargain. What's the plea bargain? The prosecutor says, we've got your buddy in the next room, he confessed, why don't you confess? Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. What if they say, we've got your DNA? There's a match, and you better confess. That is legal to lie. The prosecutor can actually lie and say, we've got your DNA as a match, you might as well confess. Well, unless you have a private attorney who's going to push this and has enough resources of a challenge, many people are going to say, they've got my DNA. I've been watching CSI. That's not hypothetical. The work of Prainsack and Fitzberger in England last year had a report saying that prisoners who were told that the prosecution had their DNA were much more likely to confess, even when they didn't have the DNA. Put that in the pipe of the racialization of incarceration, of who gets arrested on the streets of Atlanta. My colleague, Terry Levine, published some interesting work on marijuana arrests in Atlanta, and shows that while blacks are only 45% of the Fulton County, there are 89% of those arrested for marijuana possession. We now have a movement in this country to put more and more people who are arrested into the National DNA Code database. When that happens, we're going to have a more interesting racialization problem. Something I talked about a little bit earlier as familial searching. What's that? Well, the UK has pioneered familial searching. That's when you go into the database and you have a match. It's only, let's say, 7 or 8 loci out of the 13, because it's degraded. It's only 7 or 8. That means probably didn't do it, but somebody in his family did. So the DNA is there in a national data bank, and it's being used now in familial searching in several states, including California. California agreed just 8 months ago to familial searching. UK pioneered it. We now have it. Yes.
About a year ago, I was watching the Colbert Report, and Fred Venture was on, and he announced that through his Venture Institute, And so I was wondering, that factor of 10 and what that can mean for someone like Venter, who's searching, who's using his genetics to say, well, I am really different from you, and that's good for me because.
Well, my colleague, I'll get to the question, but let me start with my colleague, Jonathan Marks, who wrote a book saying we're 98-point-something% chimpanzee. And what he meant by that was, look, that small percentage make a huge difference, right? Well, this 0.1 or 0.2% can make a huge difference in, for example, your phenotype. That's obvious, right? The claim is that it'll make a huge difference in your capacity to absorb or not a certain drug without having a reaction. So that 0.1% is and can be huge in terms of a particular phenomenon. It can mean that you do or do not have hemophilia or Tay-Sachs or beta thalassemia. That little point 1 on that particular allele can have a consequence for you. Now you add another 0.% on that, and the machine goes up by all the factors that you could imagine. So yes, when Craig Venter says we found even more variation, he is noting that the capacity of the machine to find more and more difference is by a geometric increase. It's extraordinary.
I was just thinking that if you think about Venter's work and the way he's using difference, and let's talk about the different countries and consortiums for finding genetic similarities so that you can use it for pharmacogenetics. It's interesting now, that we have people looking for sameness so that they can help to treat, and we have Venter on the other side of it saying, oh, it's so good.
Well, okay, I'm not sure people are looking for sameness in order to treat. They're still looking for differences. They're looking for patterns of sameness in order to get at the differences that might explain the delivery of a drug to, quote, those people. If after all, if you're looking for sameness, then a blockbuster drug would work, wouldn't it?
Well, within a group of people, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is that this kind of balance of let's look at difference so that we can treat the individual for certain people, right?
Yes.
Designed
Or certain
people, then now we're going to do mass kind of difference that we can treat.
Yes, I think both parts of the equation are true, but what we're seeing in the last short period is much more of a concern for a focus on difference of a large population. So we have the difference of, quote, Pan-Asians. Why would we take ERESA to Asia? Well, because of the particular configuration of Asians who have been tested. They do better. So now we're going to have this drug for Asians. That's not individualized. That's a huge population. That's why I was referring to the India Genome Project and what they're concerned about. They're concerned about avoiding what they call biopiracy. Having the U.S. come in and do the analysis, they're worried they were going to find these patterns and then give them drugs and then charge them more. So they're saying, we want ownership of this. They're looking for a difference too.
But it's interesting how they map onto that. I mean, those categories.
The categories, mongoloid. Yeah. And that's this year's research. We're not talking about 20 years ago there. Yes.
Is there a non-trivial percentage of false positive matches?
You have to ask someone who has done the comparative work. The problem with that, the answer to your question, it requires science. And science requires comparative work, not just one lab giving you results. And you think that would be imperative in a case where there's life or death. You think that prosecuting attorneys would say, of course we want to open this up to an investigation. Right? Instead, what they say is, and here's the language here over and over again, we want closure. Is that the language? We want closure. The families want closure. And to open this up for investigation to another laboratory is to run the risk of Houston. You know what happened? There's a Houston lab scandal about 5 or 6 years ago. The Houston lab had done such sloppy work that upon investigation, there were quickly 150 who were just exonerated, as a term for it. People are pushed off. Doesn't matter, you know what I mean. Then they discovered the same thing was true in Virginia. And it went around that there were another 4 or 5 labs all of a sudden had been convicting people, had let people out of prison because of the problematics with forensic labs. That's where forensic analysis is taking us now. Okay, I think I've exhausted you, so thank you very much.
I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's been a very stimulating, long, but very stimulating day. And we hope that all of you will stay in touch and stay active and help us shape where this initiative heads in the near future. So thanks very much.
Stay a little longer. Stay and hang out. Yes.
Are you going to organize the chairs and some of the room? How is it going to be set?
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.